Welcome back to another episode of Neuroscience Digest, powered by my BrainWise coach. I am Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And we are so excited that you have joined us for another episode where we go through some of the most recent research that Phil has come across in the field of neuroscience. And Phil helps us to break it down, understand what's going on, and if there's any practical application that we might want to apply in our everyday life. So, Phil, I think you've got a really interesting topic for us. So what's going to be our topic today? And let's dive in.
There was a recent article published in Nature magazine. I think it was published like the 2nd of February. So, it's 3 or 4 days old, but it came across my screen. And the headline attracted me. It said, How Learning Handwriting Trains the Brain. The science behind the cursive. Now, you may have been tracking some of this, that cursive writing was, when I grew up, we all learned to write cursive. I learned to write italic cursive, which was even more different. But then in about the early 2000s, as digital technologies came about, people started saying it's not worth teaching kids cursive writing. And so there's been a bit of a brain war going on for the last 20 years. But now some of the more recent research is coming out saying, no, actually, it's not just the writing aspects of it, but there's some brain cognitive functioning that doing cursive writing actually assists in. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Okay, let's do it. That sounds really interesting. And I did not learn italic cursive, but I did learn cursive.
Yeah. And so, as you know, in the digest version, what I do is something intrigues me, and then I'll go and do some research. So I'm going to quote from that original article, and then I'm going to quote from some of the other articles I researched during the morning. So it says here, cursive is making a comeback. The looping handwriting style, defined by flowing, connected letters, has faded from curricula in places such as the United States, Finland, and Switzerland, as schools increasingly embraced digital tools. New Jersey has now become the latest United States to bring penmanship back into the classroom, requiring schools to teach it. And they're going to teach cursive to children in grades 3 to 5, that's about 8 to 11, and it joins about 24 states that in the past decade have reintroduced similar rules. Now, some countries didn't ever get rid of it. France and Brazil, for example, never stopped teaching cursive. So the emphasis of teaching cursive really came out of us. And so last week, New Jersey just introduced a bill saying that he believed, this guy's name is Phil Murphy, he said that learning cursive can offer additional cognitive benefits for students. Wow. So it's not just the writing, it may be even deeper than that. So let's dig in and see what some other people are saying.
Okay.
So there's a woman called Karen Harmon James. She's a developmental neuroscientist at Indiana University, who says, this is a sort of it's a double negative here. It's not uncommon for people not to know cursive in the United States, where this form of handwriting was dropped as a requirement in 2010. All right, so it's about 15 years ago that we've not been teaching cursive. However, there's some interesting research been going on. Researchers found that children who learn to write letters as opposed to type them, activated brain areas which were similar to the brain areas activated when adults read, a pattern that didn't appear in children who only learn to type. So there's something different when you actually write things down than type things in. And we've always thought that was the case in the brain, but now we're actually seeing that to be true. A guy in the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Audrey van der Meer, compared the brain activity of children while doing handwriting while typing. So they're in an fMRI machine and they've got a network of electrodes on their heads. And they found that during handwriting, the brain's electrical activity was concentrated near the learning and memory centers of the brain, whereas during typing, those activities are much less involved. So let's translate that into something that's applicable and doable. And basically says, if you want to learn something and remember it, write it down rather than key it in. It's
Yeah.
simple. And it turns out you don't actually have to write a lot down. Now, what we are doing here is all the studies, all the research I did this morning was around what I'll just call Western writing. It is not around calligraphy or Japanese kanji or kanji or any of those. We're focusing on actual sort of the 26 characters in the alphabet, or maybe in the Norwegian alphabet, there's more, I don't know.
Right.
But anyway, so it seems like there is a benefit to not only doing written things rather than typing things, but doing it cursively as well. There's more.
Right.
Anyway, so that was the original piece of research. And I think Liam, our BrainWise listeners are probably knowing me well enough by now, that going, I can't leave well enough alone. So I've got to go and research that. So I did a bit of research this morning. The first one, I won't go into a lot of detail, but I just give you the headline here. It says, handwriting, but not typewriting, leads to more widespread brain connectivity. So basically, when you're handwriting, you're engaging a much greater proportion of the neurons in your brain than if you're just typing. Hey, that's pretty important. It's a little bit of added data saying, yep, this seems to be true. And by the way, all of this research, I always restrict to what's happened in the last 3 years. So this isn't back in 1950 or something like that. It's all very recent research. So let's take a look at something else. And this is a bit more detail. I didn't even know there was a battle. And it says, the neuroscience behind writing, handwriting versus typing. Which one wins the battle? All right, let's take a look. And it says here, by synthesizing findings from neuroimaging studies, we explore how handwriting and typing differentially activate brain regions associated with motor control, sensory perception, and higher order cognitive functions. That's basically the prefrontal cortex, right?
Right.
Handwriting activates a broader network of brain regions involved in motor, sensory, and cognitive processing. Typing engages fewer neural circuits, resulting in more passive cognitive engagement, i.e., you're not learning much when you're keying stuff in. Despite the advantages of typing in terms of speed and convenience, handwriting remains an important tool for learning and memory retention, particularly in the educational contexts. Well, that's a pretty powerful statement.
Yes.
And basically, since 15 years ago, all the schools decided to go against this. And what does that actually mean to our BrainWise listeners? So if your parents and your kids are not learning cursive at school, you might want to think about how you could introduce that as a game at home, teaching how parents write rather than how children write. And hey, do you want to write like other kids, or do you want to write like mom and dad? And maybe they'll go, no, other kids is fine. But finding a way of introducing it at home for kids who are not experiencing it. But for every one of us, again, you and I have been in the corporate environment where you sit down in a training session, everyone opens their laptops. In fact, a better thing to do would be have pieces of paper there, have them close their laptops and write down on pieces of paper. Even if they did that translation, sort of audible translation to text at a later stage, that would involve a greater amount of learning.
Now you can, even in meeting, you can take or if you're just in general context, doesn't have to be in a meeting, you can write out your notes, take a picture of it, and then the picture can be translated directly into digital note taking, and then it can go into all these different project management tools and email, all kinds of things. But the benefit of being able to write it down and remembering it and all of those things that come with that, you can't get that from simply just typing it. And quite honestly, having computers open, phones out, all that is such a distraction in the actual session.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many classes I taught where people would say, bring their computers out, and I say, no, we're going to close them. But that's the way I take notes now. The neuroscience is telling us that's probably not as good a way of remembering things. You got the notes, but you didn't actually learn anything. Interesting stuff. Let's do 2 more, and then we'll call it a day. And this one is just the headline. Increased activity in the prefrontal cortex related to planning when you're doing a handwriting task. i.e., when you're doing a handwriting, one of the things you're going to do is, when do I have to go onto a new line? It engages planning. How am I going to make certain this is readable afterwards? So it engages a whole planning function of the prefrontal cortex.
Wow.
And so that's just a good example of when we say handwriting engages a greater set of neural circuitry, that's one of the pieces that it engages. Curious, I said Alice. And the last one I'm going to quote actually said, and this was just fascinated me when I found it. This was about teaching in higher education. It says, the quotes of the title of this is, "I felt a new connection between my fingers and my brain." Now, again, you knowing me, I can't resist finding what that's all about. I'll read you what they did. And I'm going to have to enlarge this a little bit so I can actually read. We had students reflect on their experiences of working with pen and paper for reading and writing as a mandatory assignment for the duration of a 5-week intensive course. They described the approach they took for doing that, and they had them write essays about what it was like to learn. And they said the essays elicited insightful student reflections on learning, knowing, and being. One overarching theme with new connections and 4 other theses were identified. Handwriting was important for note-taking. It increased the feeling of being present for learning. It increased the feeling of freedom to think, and it increased the importance and materiality of the reading and writing process. So the act of actually writing influenced the interpretation of what was going on for the learning and the reading and writing. So I think one of the things that I've taken away from the research today is our instincts that have always been write it down, actually now being reproven in the neuroscience world.
Which is probably why they talk about journaling a lot and the physically journaling things out, because it helps you remember what happened and probably helps with a variety of things like you were just describing, and also being able to maybe let some things go. It just creates a different sense of understanding. And when you do that, and then there's obviously some intentionality behind it versus just simply typing it or voice recording it. It sounds like I'm going to have to start doing some more physical writing than I've done in the past. Because while I learned cursive, I did transition quite a lot to digital in terms of how I take notes and journal and all those things.
Yeah. And it's funny because I know most of our listeners won't be able to see this, but I actually write everything down that I want to do during the day, rather than I've always found I've tried putting it in an Excel spreadsheet. I've tried to-do list processes. I've tried everything, but I get more things done if I write it down first thing in the morning rather than type it in. And now I think the reasons behind that, the neuroscience reasons behind that, are now becoming obvious. So if you want to remember something, then write it down if you want to increase your chances of remembering it.
Absolutely. This is great stuff. Great conversation. Very fascinating. I'm sure all the parents on the line listening, whether it's through podcast or YouTube, are going to be intrigued by this particular conversation. And I'm sure my mom, who is an educator, is going to be nodding her head the entire time. Yes, I told them not to do this. I told them not to go away from cursive writing.
And I was about to say, I bet there's a lot of teachers and educators that are going, I told you.
Yes, exactly. And this is the moment we're going to let you have your flowers for that, because you definitely did.
There we go.
Very good. Thanks again for joining us. If you enjoyed this conversation today, rate and review us on wherever it is you get your podcasts, because it does help others find us. And then, of course, comment, share, and subscribe on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram so that others can go on this journey of becoming BrainWise with all of us. So with that, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay BrainWise.